We're now going to have a feedback session, and important to involve our parliamentarians in the evidence sessions to hear where the discussion got to yesterday and to be involved in helping to set the priorities. And more than just feeding back what was said, hopefully sharing some of their own views on what they think is possible, again within existing powers, within existing budgets, both at Holyrood and at Westminster. So those of you who stuck faithfully to your allocated session will now have a chance, unlike me who floated, now have a chance to hear what was said in the other sessions. We've asked our panellists to speak for no more than 5 minutes and just focus on the main actions or conclusions, and then we'll have again at least half an hour to talk about what you've heard and to come up with your final thoughts and actions for the Assembly. So, thank you very much. Why don't we start with the sessions that we're in here? So the fuel poverty session at the back. Drew, do you want to come and give us the feedback? Thank you.
You want me to come over, Jim, and do it here or here?
Oops. Hi everyone. It was a great privilege to be here for a wee bit of the afternoon yesterday and hear, to be frank, some of the real anger in the fuel poverty session about people's bills, about the confusion that they face, about the injustices that people see in terms of profits in energy companies, the money that they pay out themselves, and the assistance that's available to them. So it's been really useful for me. It's been a whole a massive pile of things that were raised. I'll come on to the three, but just to give you a snapshot of some of the other ones where we didn't come up with, we didn't specify as being something that we could practically do something about today. Lots of stuff around regulation of the industry in general, issues around how and why we target assistance versus universalism, pretty big questions, and that issues around thresholds and then the cliff faces that people face if you, if you're just below a threshold to achieve something, or if your work status changes and you're no longer able to get support that you used to be able to. One quite interesting thing that came into difficulty in publishing some of the good news and things that actually are happening around energy assistance and supporting people in fuel poverty, and that not being something that it was something that was very difficult to communicate, which then has an impact on how people then access the services that are available. And so one suggestion was that if you could save £500 a year out of your fuel bill, then maybe we should try and to encourage people to think about what they might use that £500 to do, and would that be a way of engaging in them to try and seek the help that they might need to change things. So the three specific things, Jim, were first of all really around the role of landlords in both educating tenants and rolling out some of the simple measures which might assist people in terms of improving their energy efficiency, but very much coming from the standpoint of not seeking to blame people in fuel poverty for saying, well, you obviously don't know, enough about how to heat your home, and therefore you need to be educated about it. In that sense, it's more kind of practical help. So the simple things that can be done around draft proofing, things like that, and challenging landlords to actually do that, making sure that landlords do simple things like provide everyone, when you go into a home, with instructions of how to use your heating system, and an acknowledgement that doesn't always happen in the social sector, and it happens even to a lesser extent in the private sector. So one outcome that I took from that is I will write to all the social landlords in Glasgow that I represent and ask them specifically what their fuel poverty strategy is, and raise some of those questions for landlords that came out of that. And I'll also take a look at examining how we can use some of the regulation that now exists around landlords in the private sector to see if there is anything that we can do to promote energy efficiency and action to tackle fuel poverty arising from that. HMO legislation was mentioned as a way of being able to do that, but HMO legislation is always mentioned as a way of being able to get private sector landlords to do it, and basically you can't use HMO legislation to do it because it's there for a different purpose, which is to protect people for different reasons. So we can maybe look at the landlord register as a way of thinking about whether we can challenge private sector landlords to do some of that. Big issue around self-disconnection was the second one, Jim, and we talked about, in the past there might have been an issue about people being disconnected by their fuel company, particularly over the winter months. And in law, fuel companies are no longer allowed to do that and haven't been allowed to do that for a long time. But instead, that problem, rather than going away, is simply switched to people self-regulate and turn off their own heating. So the need for possibly a campaign that encourages people, rather than to turn off, but to turn to help, and to try and achieve some behaviour change around that. And the third thing that really came through an awful lot through the session yesterday and again today was about just eligibility for assistance schemes. And the real need to look at that again. So our third action was to task the Fuel Poverty Forum to go away and specifically look at how this ties into passported benefits, and particularly how it will link in terms of the consideration that's going on in Scotland and just now about implementation of welfare reform changes that have come from the UK. And I'm a member of the Welfare Reform Committee, so that's certainly something that I'll follow up with the Fuel Poverty Forum to make sure that we do. Thanks, Jim.
Great, thanks, Drew. Bang on time, and practical and focused, and a commitment from Drew personally as well to follow up some of those points. Brilliant. Why don't we move on to big issue of child poverty and come to Bob. So both UK and Scottish governments signed up to binding targets on reducing child poverty, ending child poverty. Tell us the flavour of the discussion, please, Bob.
Okay, thanks. Can I start off with some context setting things that didn't make it onto our top 3 list? There were some themes. One was, whenever we're designing services, we should do it where possible from a grassroots level, putting children at the centre, because local communities know best which works for the children there. I suppose the buzzword would be co-production, but that did come through what people were saying. Also using the third sector, the voluntary sector, to work in partnership with the statutory services, because they can help reduce the stigma and resistance to accessing statutory services. That came through during some general discussions, and also the general discussion did actually say, in terms of childcare, which we'll come on to, if it was males that were most hampered by the childcare issue, would politicians have done it by now, quite frankly, are some of the issues that we come up with. And whatever we decide today, we were asked, please, 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 can we get a long-term vision for what we do with childcare rather than just from one election to the next? I think that came up quite strongly. Okay, into the kind of 3 things that we tried to focus on. One of the things was we asked that can every parent carer get a reasonable choice to access affordable, high quality, flexible and appropriate childcare. Now that's very general and it sounds very good. I should point out there's some specific inequalities within that as well, come up within the group in terms of those with disabled children and those in more rural areas as well. In terms of action points on that, I think that we said, look, we can only going to get action points if we get cross-party consensus on it, rather than a bidding war between one party and another over whether it's 400 hours, 420 hours free childcare. We have to move beyond that. So how can we get that cross-party consensus and drive change? The suggestion came up that we could have a committee. There's 3 committees in the Scottish Parliament, could each hold inquiries in this, which be done in a non-party political way. There's 2 bills going through the Scottish Parliament, 2 children's bills going through the Scottish Parliament, which could be used to highlight this issue. So that came up. I think I'll take a pledge to monitor the children's bills to see where we can actually make representations on that. And actually the committee that I'm vice chair of could be one of the committees that could be doing an inquiry on that. We can't obviously speak for the committee we sit on. Also in childcare, very quickly, it was asked something we could actually do at a Scottish level. In England, they've got an economic case been made for childcare 0 to 5. Several billions of pounds would be saved to the economy in England if that was a universal provision. Can we get a similar work done in Scotland to put where the economic benefits are to the UK government, the Scottish government and local authorities? Because if we get that done, we can actually maybe drive more change and show how it's actually an investment and can be affordable. So that was on childcare. We had a lot of discussions in relation to looked after children, and mostly it's about kinship carers, but not just kinship carers. And the 2 things we want to see happen, the first one that we'll all be aware of, is to try and get some kind of consistency in kinship care payments across Scotland between local authorities, driving up to parity with foster carers. That was the first thing. But the second thing that came through, just as powerful, is actually it is about the money, but it's also about access to other services at a local level, including psychological services, where kinship carers don't feel they're getting parity of service with foster carers and other people within the community. In terms of my personal approach to this, I've done a lot of work in kinship care, but I think I'll touch base with the Glasgow City Council, and maybe find out how Glasgow City Council seek to do that, because I think they could do better, and all other local authorities could do better as well. Finally, on welfare reform, 3 things come through in relation to that. One was in relation to how these changes are going to affect lone parents, particularly those with children 5 and older now, how the tax credit changes are going to impact on families, and how families with children with disabilities will be affected in relation to DLA and PIP, and there's issues there. But most of the practical solutions came in relation to this section, where a suggestion was made that actually local authorities have got strong housing benefit data, which if they used appropriately, they could identify the families where we could do some proper income maximisation work and get some welfare benefit support. And there's a feeling that local authorities have not done well enough in relation to that. And secondly, the Scottish Government and the Welfare Reform Committee the Scottish Parliament has established have to come up with, yes, within existing resources and existing powers, put all that to one side, they have to mitigate the worst effects of the welfare reforms where possible, so they have to be held to account. I think that kind of pretty much sums up where we were with it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Bob. I managed to get into parts of that session and was really struck by the value yesterday of hearing from some work going on in Glasgow through Rosemount Lifelong Learning, and the points about equalities, disability, rural aspects to this, very well made again. So you mentioned there welfare reform, so why don't we move on to Anne McGuire, who was in this room, part of the welfare reform session, and hear about your actions.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this morning and this afternoon session. The background, obviously, to the welfare reform discussion in many respects could have been quite depressing, but actually was quite positive in many respects. There was a recognition that community resilience is important, that people need to look out for each other, and that the intermediary often will be the local community or voluntary organisation. There was an identification at one point that we might need to relearn some of the skills of solidarity that were around in previous years. I think I picked it up from a reprise of yesterday's, that it was about learning from our own history. But the main points that we picked up, we actually had 9, but we've managed by a bit of an executive decision, myself and John Dickey, to hone them down to 3 to comply with the terms of the task. The first one is, and I think this may dovetail into Rob and Drew's point, which is that there is an opportunity, in fact, with the transfer of funding from the UK under the current administrative situation for the Social Fund Council tax benefit and housing benefit. That will be transferred to the Scottish Government, and there is an opportunity there to look at how that system can prioritise people in Scotland in a way that might be different from the way that it's done just now, particularly taking into account people who are in poverty. So although the system is changing at a UK level, there is an opportunity at Scottish level under the extensive powers that are going to be given through the transfer of funding under the Barnett formula to look at how that new scheme can be devised. There was a strong and powerful request that disabled people and their organisations should be part of an open dialogue with politicians, that it's not about consultation, it is genuinely about co-production. It's nothing for us without us, which was the mantra of the disability movement in the early 1990s. And I think there is a fear was expressed that perhaps there had been some reversal in that sort of approach, that it is about being there from the beginning and not just being part of a consultation process once politicians or officials' minds have already been made up as to the direction of travel. So there was a strong and powerful plea for that. And I suppose a couple of other elements, I'll crave your indulgence by doing 4. One is that if we're talking about pulling back benefits, etc., we should also be looking at the other side of the equation, which is making sure that those people who avoid tax actually pay what they are due to pay to society, and that would help rebalance not just the image of what is happening, but actually rebalance the reality, because it is money that is lost to the exchequer and to the taxpayer. So that certainly was part of the discussion. And the last point was that local organisations are certainly feeling the pinch when it comes to funding decisions. And there was a view that perhaps we need to look at how local government is funded. The council tax freeze has obviously had some sort of impact, and it's whether or not a continual council tax freeze is really the way in which we want to fund local government, because the impact of councils not having the money is that many community organisations are really finding it hard to be refinanced in the current environment, and if it continues for longer, it's where those organisations are going to find future funding. And one final point that a colleague grabbed me on the way out, that he felt that we hadn't dealt with as a real practical issue, is that those organisations that are involved in advocacy, they should be there to help support disabled people who are making claims or who are making appeals to tribunals, that the success rate of having someone with you is higher when you go to a tribunal than not having someone with you. So there's a real challenge there for advocacy organisations to look at how they can best support people in those situations. And that ends the judgment of the welfare reform jury.
Very good. Thank you very much. I know that people will want to come back on all these points, but I anticipate quite a few more questions specifically on welfare reform and mitigation, both locally and Scotland as a whole. Thank you very much. Let's move on to sustainable communities. And Kenneth Gibson was in that group.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I'm going to actually use the pages from the flip chart for 2 reasons. One reason to ensure that I accurately reflect the views that were expressed, and the other reason being that I can't read my own handwriting, so it'll stop me stuttering and stammering over my own words. Like colleagues who have spoken earlier, I'll touch on some of the other issues that were discussed before I go on to the 3 main topics which myself and Andy decided would be the 3 most important. Again, like Anne, we took an executive decision on that, but I'm sure people in the group will agree once they've heard what they are. So first of all, we had a discussion about the need for a policy of all authorities with regard to transfer of assets. So there's real frustration about land ownership and access to land and facilities, and there has to be some clarity on how that issue is addressed. Political integrity came up, and not just political integrity with regard to elected representatives, but also officers who actually serve the Scottish Government, the UK Government, and of course local authorities. There were real concerns about that. There was an expression that we need to have an agreement that not only will anchor organisations be consulted, but in actual fact their voices will be taken on board so that they're not just heard, but their views are acted upon. And that was an issue that many people actually came to the facilitators with. A regular forum for sharing ideas, best practice. There are many organisations who have been there, done it, and bought the T-shirt. And I think there's a need for a facility whereby people can come together to actually learn from others and indeed let other people gain and benefit from their experience rather than reinvent the wheel. And there was also a view that anchor organisations should be involved in the preventative spend agenda and become strong community advocates for that. We had a bit of a discussion about community planning partnerships, and the view was very strongly expressed that they are not really to do with the communities, but they're more about strategic planning partnerships, and they should really be renamed. If that's their job, then they should be that should be what they should be called, and there shouldn't be a kind of pretense, as some people put it, that they're there to become involved with communities when they clearly are not. It was felt that housing associations, because of their role in many communities, should be used as a catalyst for building community capacity and becoming involved with helping support community organisations, as indeed many of them actually do. And there has to be much more involvement in the strategy and procurement that we have in Scotland by the third sector. That was also felt very strongly. Community regeneration should be a scale and involve of community level, and should involve community participation, and should not always be top down, but where possible should be bottom up, because people know what is best for their communities, and consultation and design of community regeneration programmes should involve local people at the earliest possible stage. And there should be much more parliamentary scrutiny of community development. Now, I have to point out they weren't talking about more monitoring, because many community organisations feel that they're monitored to death, but the processes whereby governments come to the decisions that they actually reach. Now, we then, of course, we then come to the three main topics which Andy and I actually settled on, because I do think these were crucial. And one was a need, first of all, to settle the definitions of communities and sustainability. We all use all these definitions, but there doesn't seem to be any set meaning as to what they actually mean. What is sustainability to one person could be completely different to someone else. Clarity and transparency in the funding system was seen as absolutely critical, because there's a plethora of grants that can be applied here, there and everywhere for loads of funding streams, whether it's UK, whether it's Scotland, whether it's local government, and no one person or no one organisation can possibly get a full grasp of how to access these. And there's a disconnect between need and access to grants, and often it's the fact that people do not know how to access or where to access them. And similar to that, there's an issue about decluttering policy. There's so much complexity in terms of regeneration. So I think there has to be a real issue of clarity, one-stop shops for energy and indeed community grants, and decluttering policy. And those were the findings of the Sustainable Communities Group. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kenny. We heard earlier from Bob about new legislation around children, and we also have in this area, I think towards the end of next year, legislation coming on stream with the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. So there is a time point in the horizon with new Scottish legislation to be influenced. So there's an opportunity there that we might want to come back to in our discussions. But finally, by no means least, Patrick Harvie was taking part in the session on alternative economic models. Patrick.
Thanks very much, and thanks again for the opportunity to participate in the event today. We were discussing alternative economic models, and so it's perhaps no surprise that the people who chose to be in that room were already convinced, perhaps everybody in the whole conference is already convinced, that there's something fundamentally wrong with the current economic model, not just that it's failed us. Wow, that was an easy round of applause. Not just that it's failed us in the last few years with the recession, but that for decades before that we've seen a steady increase in inequality domestically and inequality around the world as well. So, having said that, there was one point very clearly made, that we need to find a way to get beyond talking about this as alternative economic models, and it needs to be about challenging the mainstream or proposing new rather than thinking that it's got to be alternative. But it does cover a great deal, everything from small sustainable social enterprises, social businesses doing something locally in a different way, to issues about the way the national and indeed the global economy works as well. There was several themes that came through, which were about the relationship between people and power, both democratic political power and economic power, and a need not just to challenge, for example, the way business operates, but to be willing to engage with business as well. And this was a theme that came back. We touched on a number of industries, from energy, commodities, manufacturing, retail, house building, and a need to acknowledge that when community benefits are talked about, it needs to go beyond a kind of lip service. So in challenging the way that we think about the economic models we're running, we also need to challenge the way that business thinks as well, rather than just persuade them to do something a little bit piecemeal as a token gesture. The three themes that I'm going to touch on as the areas where people wanted action. One was on measuring what matters. Whether we're talking about measuring economic growth, how we account for what's a successful economy. We need to challenge the idea that a successful economy is simply one that grows, because as we've seen, economic growth can be hoarded by the few, while the social and environmental harms created by that activity are inflicted on the many. So challenging the question about what we measure, but not just in terms of kind of economic indicators like GDP, also things like the welfare system, which measures people's contribution only in terms of paid work. And there are many other forms of contribution to society and to the economy which are devalued. Not just we fail to value them, we devalue them, and we have a system which harasses people for spending their time making those kind of contributions to their community. And so there's a theme there about measuring what matters. And Oxfam is clearly already working very well on that and has brought a range of organisations around the table. So some of that is already underway and we should be contributing to it. There was some discussion about how we use forthcoming legislation. People have mentioned the Community Empowerment Bill and the Procurement Bill. And so that's our second area, is the opportunity is now to start defining those things, rather than waiting until people like the people on this panel, politicians, define them. It needs to be people like those of us in this room, those of all of you in this room, defining those areas. Otherwise, we'll end up probably with just, here's your dose of empowerment, take it or leave it. And that's kind of the opposite of what we need to be achieving. So radical thinking about the decentralisation of power in what is Scotland or the UK, a very centralised society. And finally, there was a question which I'm afraid isn't very specific or concrete, but I think it's pretty central, which is the question of radicalism, and a sense within the room that although the word radical is sometimes associated in many people's minds with the left, it's actually the right who have been more successful in pushing forward radical change that I think many of us are angry about and didn't want to see in the first place, but they still have, I think, in the view of many people in the room, a bit more willingness to say radical things and to challenge in radical ways and to create radical change. If we want to be able to challenge the current economic models and propose new or alternative economic models, we need the ability to recapture the ownership of the concept of being radical, which I think has been lost. Hope that's helpful.
Great. Yep. Very much. Thank you. Thank you to you all, and for sticking to time. The Twitter feed is going mad, which I think is a good sign. Just what I noticed, one of the comments was something I neglected to mention, just to say we have 3 political parties taking part this afternoon. We did invite both Liberal Democrat and Conservative parties to send parliamentarians to take part. That wasn't able to happen. If you've seen the original agenda, you'll also know that we'd invited the Scottish Secretary Michael Moore to take part, but he was unable as well. So just to reassure you, we did seek as much political balance as possible, which we had this morning, but not this afternoon. However, we do have these 5 fine parliamentarians waiting to respond to your comments and questions. So can we have a show of hands for initial comments and questions? And I'll try and take people who haven't asked a question already just in this first round. So could you put your hand up if you haven't asked a question already? Should we start over here? I will come to you. But let's start just here. Thank you.
My name is Alison MacLeod and I'm from Applecross Community Company. Applecross is in the northwest of Scotland, a very remote rural community, a very small community. We're progressing a community-owned hydro scheme, which will be an income generator for the community, so that we have finance to at least partially resolve our own challenges. And there are major challenges. For a start, our grid infrastructure is so poor that we can only export 90 kilowatts. So that restricts the size, although we have the capacity to generate a lot more. Secondly, we have difficulty with our absentee landlords who want a high level of rent for themselves. They refuse to acknowledge the difference between a commercial development and a community development. And thirdly, we're going to have major problems getting the banks to agree to finance the scheme because they want schemes that are around $1 million. Ours will cost about 600,000 to develop. And that is because of the grid infrastructure, we can't do a bigger scheme. We'd like to do a bigger scheme. And I wondered if any of the panellists had any suggestions as to what the Scottish Parliament could do to help us do this, because we need some recognition of the effort that we've put into this as a very small community, that they want communities to take on things. We are doing our very best to do this, and there are 170 adults in our community. That's the size of it. A huge amount of volunteer work, a lot of stress, and it might not work after all that. So, I mean, we need some, if there were, say, a community feed-in tariff that was at a higher level than commercial companies or private landowners were able to get, that recognised the particular challenges that we face and the particular benefits if we do manage to put this scheme in place.
Thank you very much. Really interesting proposition around a community feed-in tariff at a different level that allows small, remote communities with lots of technical and practical difficulties making the vision reality, enabling them to be part of this shift in our energy economy. Any other first-time speakers who wanted to raise questions or comments? Remarkably quiet this afternoon. Yes, this just over here. Thank you. Great.
My name's Jim MacDonald. I'm from Falkirk. One of the issues that I didn't hear arising at the fuel poverty was that if we had ownership of the energy that was being supplied, then in my view that would help to address issues of fuel poverty. And I just wonder if any of the panel would support nationalisation or renationalisation of the sources of energy as a means of solving the problems of fuel poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, folks with their hands up to begin with. I didn't come to the lady here, and thank you. And then the gentleman just behind, thank you.
It's a question about local taxation, and we hear time and time again how limited we are in Scotland by what happens in Westminster, but obviously an area, even now, whatever happens in whether we get independence or not, we can do things with local taxation. And I know that the Green Party has a proposal that would allow a lot more with local tax, with a local income tax, and I think it's a land tax as well. I don't know why the SNP, which did have proposals for a local income tax, has since shelved them. Why aren't we doing an awful lot more at the local level so we can actually fund all these things that we so clearly need and so clearly want?
Thank you. And just table behind, thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask that Do you think that the panel thinks it's a good idea to have everybody being equal in terms of money? We have a situation where we have people with learning disabilities who some of the panel know that I campaign for they may be less affected with the welfare reform bill, but the end communities and people who live beside them are going to be affected by the welfare reform bill, and they have so we don't want to end up with disability hate crime. So that's my first point. My second point is that we have a political game going on in Glasgow City Council and the SNP government about how much resources that Glasgow City Council has, and that's has affected people with learning disabilities who are getting charging policy. Mine is 21% of my income, and so the question is there about how you're going to get people out and about in the communities and not be and get people who cannot go out independently. They need support, but they can but need to pay for their workers as well. So they get a lot of money out of their income, and they've got to pay for their support workers, so they cannot go out at all, and then their health suffers. And finally, how are you going to relating to that? How are you going to get more funding towards supported community care in the communities, because the wages of our support workers have been frozen for 5-6 years or more, and again their health is suffering, and a lot of people are sick, and you know, and I think so I think we need. So I think a lot of issues need to be addressed, and we need to look after the vulnerable and not. And we don't want to see the news, well, we need to take money out of here to show keep the money out there, you know, because it's not worked for many, many years, and it's not going to, and side of businesses don't like take money out of them, or it's we have poor people like the welfare reform bill, they take money out so they can help businesses. We need to have an equal distribution across society. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. And the gentleman at this table. Thank you.
My name is James Troland. The first one is for Bob, which is kinship carer cross-party consensus. There isn't a cross-party group on kinship carers. It's been raised but hasn't been established. So it could well be, it looks at, you know, that would be a starting point. The second thing is linking up a number of points, the community tariff, nationalisation and so on. I attended at Strathclyde University 5 days thing on security of energy supply. And the model that was looked upon, this was on behalf of the Scottish Government. I can't remember which one. So we'll call that neutral. And what they were finding was that even though the thinking coming from a practitioner's perspective was making sure the extremities, the outer areas were connected, you found that the being driven by the energy companies was the centralisation model, which is left over from the days of General Electric's, the CGE, i.e. everything comes down the centre. So the whole infrastructure was down the centre. And when you raise the point, why can't it be cost effective to link to gear to, they didn't want to know. So therefore, if one's looking at sustainability and there is a barrier there, then if we're looking at security and the national security, you cannot ignore energy. Therefore, any competent government must build in a contingency plan that their people are losing out. And if it takes the renationalisation from a security perspective, because that's similar to when the banks went down the tube and they used anti-terrorism law to get Iceland's money. So therefore, why would someone extreme who can generate, because it might be more windier in Applecross than it is in Castlemilk, but they're not being allowed. And that in some ways means it becomes unsustainable.
Thank you.
So if the existing model is the old 50s model, where it was all down the spine, but not allowing or any area to connect, that needs to be re-examined from the perspective of energy security.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Let's come to our panellists to pick up any of those points you feel you'd like to respond to. Bob, do you want to go first?
I'm obviously not going to respond to all of them because there was so many, because it was mentioned in relation to kinship care. It was reasonable for me to go in first. I think there is cross-party consensus in kinship care. I know the carers group had a kinship care agenda, couldn't make it to that particular meeting. When I was talking about cross-party consensus, I think we're there. It was in the childcare agenda where there could be for some radical reform. I think you have to get everyone together on board for that. But yeah, kinship care, yeah. But I wanted a couple of other points. We mentioned about sustainable communities, and someone mentioned the Feed-In Tariff, and that's something that I've done a bit of work on. Of course, the Feed-In Tariff is absolutely shot. There never was a differential Feed-In Tariff for the benefit of particular communities where they've got specific issues in rural areas. The majority of the Feed-In Tariff, I understand, was taken quite a lot by solar panel industrialisation of the Feed-In Tariff in the south of England, where farmers put solar panels up across the fields and basically maxed out the UK's budget for Feed-In Tariff. So we do have to bring it back, we have to target it, we have to make it for communities, and it has to be community controlled. I would completely agree with that. In terms of Edom, who mentioned about his issues, and I would say that I'd be interested to chat to you about any experiences you've had in terms of, I think you mentioned hate crimes and how the police deal with it. If it's not treated as an aggravated offence, whether they're saying there's not a statutory basis for that, I'd be interested to know. But in terms of how you and others support themselves in your situation, we're about to look at a self-directed support bill going through the Scottish Parliament, and that's supposed to be giving everyone choices for the position that they're in. And I think that's something that I'm minded as it goes through our committee. We have to look at not just the elderly, not just other key groups, but make sure that the learning disabled are there as well. So that's maybe 3 of the points that were touched on.
Thank you. And anyone else on energy or one of the other? Anne, thank you.
Can I pick just up a wee bit? I want to give a plug to a village in the Stirling constituency in Fintry, and I think actually I saw a tweet from them. Their Fintry Development Trust have led the way actually in how you galvanise a village community into using the current regime for the benefit of that local community. I appreciate that obviously Fintry is closer to the main centres of population than Applecross is, but I think what Alison has pointed out is there is a big debate to be had about where the energy can be produced in places like Applecross and in other places up the west and north of Scotland. And I could just say that probably Cathkin Braes might be quite as windy. I'm not quite sure the guy from Castlemilk, I don't know if there's much wind up there, but it's how we get that energy from where it can be produced to where it's needed. Now, I think all of our MSPs have gone through the issues about the transmission lines coming in, down, and these are not easy questions for communities, because obviously Applecross wants to see the exporting of an energy generation capacity that they have, but then to bring that energy generation down into the main centres of employment. There are other communities that say, well, actually, we don't really want these transmission lines so close to us, or we want them undergrounded. So all of those things have to be in the mix. But I take Alison's point that there needs to be better support if we want local communities to capitalise even on what is there at the moment. And I think she makes a very relevant point about additional support for communities in terms of feed-in tariffs.
Patrick, you wanted to come in as well?
Yeah, there's a huge opportunity on not just community-owned, but also one or two people mentioned it, publicly owned energy as well. I don't see that in terms of the wholesale nationalisation of an industry, but an element of public ownership could be really, really profound. And it should be easy to do. And it's not something new. It used to be the case that local councils would have their own energy company, maybe for different reasons than they would have them now. But right now, if Glasgow or any other local council in Scotland was to set up a community-owned energy company using the council's ability to borrow money for something that's going to generate revenue or savings in the future, we could be investing that in publicly owned renewable energy generating technology, in really, really energy efficient housing. When we're building new housing, there's new housing going up just across the river soon, and it will be bog standard, meeting the building regs. I'm sure it'll be very pretty and everything, but in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of energy issues, there is nothing imaginative going in there, because the builders won't do it. We need some public investment into that. If you were to do this, as well as those public energy companies buying electricity from the wholesale market and becoming the retailer, becoming the provider, then the profit from the profit element of the bill that people pay is not going siphoned off to big energy companies. It's going back in to serve the public good, to repay the debts that have been taken on to make the investments, but also to carry on the retrofit programme, because it's much more than just better new build we need. So public energy companies helping to support community energy as well could be transformational. And it comes back to this idea that so many industries have been centralised into the hands of a tiny number of multinationals. It's happened with finance and banking, it's happened with the alcohol industry, and we see some of the effects of the way the big multinationals behave less responsibly than local community businesses. We've seen it in retail, we've seen it in a whole host of industries, and we've seen it in energy as well. Decentralising energy is not just about where it's generated from, it's about decentralising the ownership as well. And there's a really transformational opportunity waiting for us there if we just step up and make it happen. Other northern European countries that the Scottish Government constantly like to refer to us and compare us with are already doing some of this stuff, and we're not.
Thank you. I'm conscious that both Drew and Kenny may want to say something here. I'm keen to press both of you on the other 2 points. One is we've been debating whether council tax freeze is right or not, but you very helpfully point out that we just have plans for local income tax in Scotland, which in the last Parliament there wasn't a majority to push through. So where have the plans gone to for scrapping council tax entirely and moving over to a different form of local taxation? And this important point that has played throughout the event on disability and the kind of cumulative effect of not just UK benefit reforms, but also what's happening locally, where people are today now losing eligibility, losing money from their care and support packages, depending on where they live in Scotland through local decisions. So local taxation, support for disabled people, two huge issues. Do either of you care to comment? Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Just first of all on local taxation, I mean, the kind of easy thing for me to say would be that I don't think the council tax freeze is funded, and I'm sure that Kenny will say that the council tax freeze is funded, and there's probably not a lot of benefit to people here in rehearsing that debate. I mean, I suppose what the first thing I would say about reform of local taxation is in general is don't forget about property. I genuinely believe that there is a role for property taxation in this country. It's something that we should do, and moving wholesale towards income. Yes, it might be attractive if you see income as being the only way of assessing what is fair for people to pay. But there is wealth tied up in property in this country, and I believe that should be taxed. So any debate around reform of local taxation, in my view, needs to have that as part of what we're talking about. And then it's, I suppose, more widely, rather than having that kind of debate that Kenny and I might have every week, in the Parliament about whether or not the council tax freeze is properly funded. If a freeze is funded, then it should be possible to deliver the services and not have the cuts that people might experience. I suppose the wider issue for this Assembly is how you actually politicise some of these issues, and I take entirely the points in the spirit which Bob makes them around achieving consensus on big areas where we need to have social change, and kinship care is an example of that. But consensus can sometimes lead you to a place where everyone signs up to a strategy or a form of words and then very little action flows from that. So you do have to give politicians some space to be able to create the debate to make sure that things are actually delivered. And kinship care is an example of that, where yes, there is consensus that more needs to be done, but we then need to politicise it to make sure that it happens. And so I suppose what I'm saying on local taxation and the poverty agenda more widely is that you have to be prepared to challenge your politicians, and as a political culture we have to be prepared to challenge ourselves, to not just talk about what country we might want Scotland to be in terms of which state we might want to live in, but what kind of Scotland we want to create. And it's how you get the political debate back focused around those issues that I think is something that people going away from this conference should think about, because I think it is, to our discredit as a parliament, that those are not the questions on which our politicians are being evaluated at present. And I think we need to get back to that kind of debate.
Kenny, do you want to?
Well, local income tax obviously remains SNP policy, but we've said that policy will be implemented with a rising tax base rather than a shrinking one which we have at the moment, given the fact that the Scottish Parliament's resource base will shrink 12.3% over 3 years, capital funding by 32%. The whole point of the council tax freeze, though, is to try and allow some stability in terms of family budgets at a time when everything else is rising. And over the course of this Parliament, the average family will be £1,136 better off over the course of that Parliament through the council tax freeze, at a time when we've heard about fuel prices going up. We hear that the family shop's going up. We've got pay freezes as well. So I think that's all to the good. Stirling actually had implemented a small council tax cut only recently, but we think that the freeze is something which we put out to the Scottish voters, and they endorsed that policy, and therefore it's appropriate that we stick with that policy over the course of this Parliament. It may be, of course, that in future that policy will change. And I suppose in terms of disability and care packages, I think it's always about trying to squeeze, frankly, a quart into a pint pot. What is important is that the people who are the most vulnerable are the people who get the most focus in terms of delivering the best possible package for their individual needs. And my colleague already talked about a new legislation that we're actually bringing forward to ensure that people do have much more independence in terms of the packages which they actually have themselves, in terms of how those packages are actually delivered to individuals, and they have much more say, so that they can discuss their packages with other care packages with the professionals who deliver the services, in order that they can get the best possible match for what they need as individuals.
If I just read out just a few figures. We don't want to get bogged down in statistics, but just on the disability point, just as a scale of what's coming and whether we're geared up for this in terms of mitigating the impact, looking at over the next 2 years, the reduction in people on incapacity benefit and ESA because they've been moved off, sometimes moved off benefits entirely. 22,500 people in Glasgow, 9,200 North Lanarkshire, 8,000 in Edinburgh, 7,705. I could go on. These are very big numbers. If we add them up for Scotland as a whole, 115,000 Scots off incapacity benefit within 2 years. Now, Labour, Anne was involved in this. The last Labour government was involved in changing some of this system. I think the plan was to do this over 10 years rather than 2. So the scale and speed of this is remarkable. And I wonder whether you feel we can do anything in Scotland which would be a reasonable mitigation solution or response to that kind of change. Any thoughts? Bob, please.
Just very briefly, you mentioned those figures. I'll give you another one. Because of benefit reforms, the welfare reforms at UK level, there's probably going to be another 100,000 children and families pushed into poverty by 2020 in terms of child poverty. So let's not pretend, when we talk about mitigation, we're not talking about making savage welfare reforms at a UK level going away. It's not possible to make them go away. So let's get the context under which we operate. What I said at the start when I was giving my presentation is because we can't make them go away under the current powers that we have is not a reason not to seek to face up to them. So can we mitigate? Well, I have to say that the avenue for mitigating is probably working around how we use some of the kind of community care grants that are coming to Scotland more effectively. But I have to say that the grants that are coming to Scotland, we're going to get less money than been spent at a UTK context. They're actually cutting the money available. They're giving that to the Scottish Parliament and they're saying, get on with it. So let's not kid ourselves on here. And in terms of what else we can do, really we have to be looking at maybe gearing up advocacy and advice services to get income maximisation, because we don't have the powers here, let's be brutally honest, to mitigate all these impacts. All we can do is make sure vulnerable people are supported as best they can under the current settlement and we maximise their income.
But beefing up advocacy, tribunals, appeals, all that infrastructure may be part of what could be created in Scotland.
Well, I'm really minded about you get a 300% greater chance of having a successful appeal if you have someone from the CAB Scotland there compared to if you don't. You're 3 times more likely. So I think we have to use a limited budget that we have more effectively, and where possible support these frontline services.
Thank you. And Patrick wants to come in then.
Yeah, I'd like to come in just on 2 things. First of all, about the welfare reform proposals. If we are serious that we think the welfare reform proposals are savage and unnecessary, I think there's a very, very strong case for refusing to implement them. And politicians... No, they are being implemented, they're going to be implemented right throughout, not by the government, but politicians who oppose this proposal should be working with the trade unions around a programme of refusal to cooperate. And I think that would be an important step forward. The second point is on tax. How do we pay for public services, including the welfare system, but all of the other public services that are so important and have been coming up throughout today? And we really need to address this question of tax. Can I just say, I don't think it matters a whit whether we think the council tax freeze is funded or not. If we all agree it's funded, all that means is we've all agreed how much the cuts add up to, right? I think if we're serious about something like community empowerment, if we're serious about the comparisons again with some of those other small independent northern European nations, we should be looking to see what they do in terms of allowing local government actually to be local government, to raise taxes on their own initiative, to decide they have a wide discretion around economic powers and the ability to raise taxes from a range of different methods. Different solutions will be right in different places. The tax base in Glasgow might be different from the tax base in a rural northern or borders part of Scotland. These abilities to make local decisions, local economic decisions, could be really transformational. We're about to have a debate in Scotland about the country's whole future. Let's not allow that debate to be determined by an economic argument that says corporation tax cuts to the big businesses in Scotland are the most important things, because then the likes of Amazon will come and create more jobs. The French, they're just about to start taxing the likes of Amazon more to support proper independent bookshops that can't survive in the current environment. We could be thinking very, very differently and radically about how we use tax, and wrest back the idea of tax from being a bogeyman, this kind of Thatcherite lie that tax is a bad thing. No, tax is a fundamentally civilised thing, and we can use it as well as all the other tools of government, even now, with existing devolved powers. And if we do that, I think we'll make the case for Scotland taking on even more economic powers in the years to come.
And did you briefly want to...
I don't want to lose the point that was made by the gentleman in the middle about disability hate crime, because I do think that has become a recurring feature and is now quite firmly on the radar of the police and hopefully of local communities. The increase in disability hate crime over the last year and a bit, I don't think is just something that's happened out of the blue. I think some of it has been fuelled by the demonisation of disabled people as part of the changes in welfare. I've said that publicly to ministers, that they had a responsibility to challenge some of the quite disgraceful stereotypes of disabled people that were being portrayed in the media over the last number of years. And Glasgow University Media Monitoring Group have done some fantastic work looking at the way in which disabled people have been identified in the leading tabloid newspapers, and how there is a correlation between that and the increasing disability hate crime. So I think that's an important issue. Can I say just a couple of other things? There is an opportunity under current powers for the current government to look at how they frame something particular to Scotland, and that is the changes that are coming down the road in terms of housing benefit, council tax benefit, and indeed social fund. The dialogue between the Scottish Government and local authorities, and indeed groups such as those represented to here, will be crucial to how people at the street level are actually going to be supported. So it's not just about, we can't do anything. Politics is about priorities, and sometimes governments have to make choices about where they put their money, and I hope the Scottish Government will make the right choice about how they look at supporting people who can be supported even under the current powers. But finally, I want to say just one thing, and this might break a little bit of political consensus here. I think it's quite irresponsible of Patrick Harvie to say that he won't implement any of the welfare not the welfare changes, but they won't implement the system. The reality is, Patrick, that if you do that, then you are putting vulnerable people even in a more disadvantaged position. What I think politicians in Scotland, working with civic society and the Scottish Government and people of goodwill across the country, is to look at how we mitigate what's coming. It would be quite irresponsible to leave people hanging with nothing because we don't like the welfare reform system that is there. That wouldn't solve anybody's problems, and frankly, I think we can look at some good examples if we pitch back in our history at where those intermediary organisations, whether it be local authorities or voluntary organisations, actually could make a difference to people's lives in the 80s and 90s, when people at that time were under severe pressure from some other welfare reform activity. So Patrick, it sounds like it's a great slogan, but frankly I think it's irresponsible.
Okay. Thank you. We have time for two more people who've already had their hands up, I'm afraid. Lady here, thank you.
I'm Marcely Craig. I'm from Aberdeen, which makes me feel a bit of a minority here today. But I guess I want to go back to several things that the panel had said. Some of this has been in fact covered by Patrick and what he said, but I do think, and I've thought this for a couple of years, I know there's a debate about whether or not, council tax freezes are funded or not, but I think it's a real irony that we have politicians who argue about mitigating the effects of the welfare reform bill, particularly on vulnerable and disabled people, and then actually force councils into council tax freezes. I mean, Aberdeen's a place people say, oh, there's lots of money in Aberdeen. And there's lots of money in Aberdeen. Some people have lots of money. There are also huge pockets of Aberdeen where there are very vulnerable and very, people on very, very low incomes. But one of the, speaking of that with the, we need to worry about our disabled people. As a result of council tax freezes, I do a lot of work with disabled people because I'm disabled myself. And I just see more and more people saying that all their day centres, their supports, their nurses, that's not council tax, but all of these difficulties are coming around, and the council saying, well, we would love to. I know the councillors will say we'd love to help, but we can't. We don't have any money. But there is a lot of money in Aberdeen if they were just able to. Put up the council tax maybe on the £1 million houses, and it wouldn't hurt these people. It wouldn't hurt some people to pay more tax. Absolutely. The most vulnerable people don't pay council tax anyway, so it doesn't affect them. There are people in the middle, and I appreciate they don't like it, and it's not a vote winner. But I think just as a moral principle, you should think about actually taxing the richer people through their property, if not through their income, and giving you more resources to actually help vulnerable people.
Thank you. We've time for two of your very, very, very brief, please.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a member of Fife Gingerbread in Fife, yeah. And basically, in the last session, we were given these cards, and we all had to put on them what we would do over the coming year to help tackle poverty and keep a promise. So I was just wondering what each one of you would do to make a pledge or a promise and assure us that you are going to do something about it.
Now, there's a certain symmetry about this. We began yesterday with Danny McCafferty, so I want to give Danny the last question.
Is it still here? A couple of things. Bob, I fully entirely agree with you when you say that we should actually be supporting the advocacy services. But unfortunately, yesterday I gave the statistics, Clydebank Independent Resource Centre. Last year, we were taking tribunal cases up in a winning rate of 67 to 61% in various categories. ATOS have changed the goalposts. We are now only gathering in 20% success rate. If we have more advocacy services, we are still going to lose because of rigged the vote. We still need advocacy services, and I would say we should have that. Patrick, we don't need to abolish the Welfare Act. All we've got to do is abolish ATOS. Scrap them, give us back our £100 million, which they've defrauded this country of, and then let's recalculate the regulations, and let's restore the pointage system to those who were qualifying last year, and that will restore their benefits because they would qualify this year. Get rid of ATOS, restore the pointage system, and you don't need to change an Act of Parliament. And we could do that quite easily. And last but not least, I did start off at the conference, and I was passionate about this. One thing we do need devolved to Scotland, and I don't care whether we get it devolved through Devil Max, through Devil Plus, or through independence. I have no preference, but I want welfare and the welfare fiscal policy devolved to Scotland so we can determine the vision for Scottish people and what kind of welfare state Scotland wants. And if the rest of the United Kingdom wants to copy us later, good luck to them. But we're not waiting for them. We want a Welfare Reform Act for Scotland, devised for Scotland and caring for the Scottish people. And that's what we should campaign for between now and the referendum.
Well said. So I want to give our panellists a chance in a sentence or two, no more, please, just to respond to those points. Did you want to start?
Amen to that. Obviously, we do want control over tax and welfare, but we also want control over the oil to help fund it as well. In terms of council tax, remember that because of the gearing effect, only 16% of local authority resources come from council tax. A 4% increase in a council's expenditure means a 25% increase in council tax, and that is quite a bite out of some people on modest incomes personal family budget. Also, in terms of the devolving council tax benefit, yes, that's great, but the UK government are only giving us 90% of the council tax resources to go with that, so there's a £39 million shortfall we've got to fund from other budgets, in addition to the £102 million we're losing through the pension clawback. But in terms of what Anne said about Patrick, I do actually agree with Anne, because I think that this kind of gesture politics is unhelpful. I think it will lead a lot of people up the garden path, and I think it's not the way to actually address this particular issue. I mean, we've got setting up a standing committee to look at the welfare reform bill, to look exactly how we can best mitigate the impact of that. Actually, as a Labour convener, not an SNP convener, but I hope that there will be strong cross-party consensus on terms of doing the best we possibly can for the people of Scotland in terms of this appalling legislation.
And Kenny, do you have a pledge to share with us over the next year?
Sorry?
Your personal pledge.
Oh, sorry. Employability. One of the things that I think that has not come out of the sessions that I've been at and in this plenary session is the issue of employability. And as Chair of the Finance Committee, we're going to undertake an inquiry into looking at how we can improve employability. Jim, you were actually at the evidence session to the Finance Committee at which that particular issue was discussed, and in fact I raised that particular issue with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others. We need to look at upskilling the people of Scotland to ensure that when there is an economic upturn, people aren't left behind and that they can gain from new employment opportunities.
Thank you. Patrick, I guess you'll want to respond to both Kenny and any of the other points.
Yeah, and also to the point down here about Atos, I think that's a useful suggestion. I read this morning, I've not seen absolute confirmation from this, but somebody was saying online this morning that they've been appointed as a sponsor of the Commonwealth Games. Can you believe that? You know, the idea that you know, a decision like that, which is about political leadership, which is about the emphasis, what kind of decisions do we expect our politicians to be endorsing, whether or not they yet have the power to implement them. I think that's an incredibly bad signal. I do think there is an opportunity. I don't mean to suggest that we should be encouraging the unions simply to refuse to operate the benefit system at all, but there's a great deal that industrial action, I think, could do to slow down and frustrate the efforts of the UK government to implement some of the worst elements of the reform programme, and I think that we should be willing to engage with that where the unions think it's possible. The point about the personal pledge, I'm a member of the Economy Committee, Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and I've already been and will continue to be using every opportunity to challenge when we're giving taxpayers' money hand over fist to the private sector, to big businesses like Diageo, who put it down the drain and then move on. We should be using that to support social, environmental and economic justice in Scotland, because economic policy for far too long has been driven by those who are already very wealthy. You know, there's a tax exile on the Council of Economic Advisers, for goodness sake, a multi-millionaire tax exile. These are the people who should be stigmatised in our society, not people who are doing their best to get through against a brutal welfare system.
Thank you. Drew.
Thanks, Jim. A lot of things to try and get in really, really quickly, but I'll try and do it quickly. First, to the colleague over at the side there, following up the council tax point. I mean, Kenny was able to give you a figure about the money that the SNP government thinks that's putting back in the families, in the pockets of families, and you can average that out. But I think the point that you're making, and I agree with you, is that there is also a monetary value that should be applied to the services that are being cut. And who is it that suffers that cut? Who are the people that are most likely to rely on local authorities for childcare? Who is it that's most likely to rely on the various other services that local authorities provide, including advice services and the benefit system? And so that extra money in the pocket across the board at the average level, which has the best impact for people on higher and middle incomes, is completely taken away for those at the lower income, who you might get a bit of small change back on your council tax benefit, with the council tax freeze, but it's not much use to you if you find out your public services have gone. On the issue of welfare reform in Scotland, I mean, I'm a member of the Welfare Reform Committee. I have to say I'm completely open-minded to what we might need to do about welfare reform in Scotland, but be careful what you wish for. You know, you can bet your bottom dollar that the private sector organisations involved in delivering the benefit system will be very interested to get into any system that is set up in Scotland to see how they can make a profit out of that. And we do not have the infrastructure that we have at the UK level to do it, and we also completely lose the ability to redistribute wealth across the whole of the island, and the biggest concentration of wealth being in the City of London. And on the welfare system, in terms of advice services, the Welsh Assembly Government have already put extra money into advice services specifically to deal with the issue of welfare reform, and we've had no commitment to do anything like that from the Scottish Government, so I'd be aware of crocodile tears around it. And specifically on it, council tax benefit and the social fund money, yes, there is a cut, but those monies are coming to Scotland. And so if the Scottish Government wants to demonstrate a case for having control of the whole benefit system, then they better demonstrate what they're going to do with the money that is coming towards them and the power that they have to do something. And finally, on the promise, I did say a couple of things when I opened that I would follow up in terms of fuel poverty and with housing organisations in Glasgow. I suppose the final one, it's the end of the session, it's what I've taken away from the event. It's kind of reinforced what I think anyway, so hopefully you'll forgive me for that. But it's about us as certainly in my view, me as a politician, advocating the case for the more equal society, and that being the goal of good government, and getting away from the idea that economic growth is the be-all and the end-all. Economic growth is important, but it is for a purpose. And the only purpose of creating greater economic growth in Scotland, in my view, is to show that wealth can be shared out more equally and life is made better for the people that live here. And in my view, it should be the goal of government to pursue that, to pursue greater economic equality in Scotland. And there are things we can do in terms of pay differentials and targeting and making sure that people at the lowest end of the income scale in an organisation wages are tied to those at the top. And that's all I would say. Thank you, Jim.
Bob?
Yeah. Just very briefly, first of all, on council tax, I think I have to say one of the reasons we're focusing on council tax is because we don't have the power over other wealth to tax within Scotland, stock shares and private wealth, and I think that's an important point to it. There's lots of other taxes we don't have, and we focus on council tax. I also have to say to Drew on council tax, you can't really take a sanctimonious view on it when the Labour Council in Stirling has reduced the council tax, and when the Labour Party in Glasgow are putting out leaflets trying to claim credit for freezing the council tax in Glasgow. So how about a political consistency? It's absolute hypocrisy, to be quite honest with you. Now, in terms of other aspects, I think I should point about the advice stuff. We've said we do have to see what will happen in the future, how we better support advice services in Scotland, but a very powerful exposition of why we need controls to Scotland in relation to welfare and benefits. And what I would say to the people gathered here is whenever the Scottish Government, in any political incarnation actually, whenever the Scottish Executive Government has consulted on these matters, they've been far more listening, and they've moulded the policies for Scotland that best suit Scotland compared to what has happened at a UK level. Now, I want to finish off by saying what I want to do in the next year in terms of tackling poverty. I think I'll re-pledge to do what I said I would do in 2007 when I first got elected, and it was actually on kinship care, because Glasgow City Council was given 0 to kinship care in 2007. I met with them, they said they were still giving 0. We've got them up to £40 a week now. We've got them up to £40 a week now. We mentioned the need to increase that further, and we mentioned the need for greater services for kinship carers across Glasgow. That's a very practical local matter that I want to take forward after the council elections, and I have no idea who's going to win those council elections in Glasgow, so that's a challenge that I'll be putting forward to whoever forms that administration.
Thank you very much. And Anne.
Thanks very much. See, the problem about, I think Jenny Hassan, I noticed, was almost implying he was getting a bit bored by the political consensus. I think the difficulty about starting to cherry-pick bits and pieces out of different areas is that you can sometimes tie yourself up in knots. Yes, we can talk about kinship carers, but in Stirling, they don't pay kinship allowance, but they do in Clackmannanshire. On the Stirling budget, and I don't want to bore people with the details, but in actual fact there was a little reservoir of money that the local authority were holding back, which could have been put into the pot to alleviate some of the pressure on people this year. So anybody wants the final details, I can give them that. On tackling poverty over the next year, I just want to respond to the colleagues. Well, actually, I'll come to ATOS as well. The only thing I would say to you, Danny, is don't let ATOS be the sole focus of your anger. ATOS, there are lots and lots of questions that we need to ask about ATOS and criticise ATOS. But remember, the policy has been set by the DWP and by this government, and it's the policy that is being implemented that and the harshness of some of that policy that we need to reflect on. Yes, there are grave concerns about ATOS, but don't let's focus all our fire on that organisation when in actual fact the context for the whole policy is the government. On the tackling poverty one, I would like to hope that as a politician, if I could deal with that first over the next year, is that I continue to concentrate our efforts on exposing exactly what this government has done to make poverty worse. And the statistics are there. The Prime Minister now has denied twice to me and twice to two colleagues that there's going to be a cut in universal credit for families with disabled children. He doesn't even know his own policy. That's coming down the line in 2013. At a local level, I'll be quite frank with you, I've put our office on an alert to start to look about how we help people who we know are going to be coming to us. We've already seen an increase in benefit cases, and how we help people locally in the best way that we can by working in partnership with the local authority, with other voluntary and community organisations, to hope that by at least working together we can offer them the support that they need, even if they're facing really difficult circumstances with the changes in welfare reform. So on two levels, one at a UK level and the other at a local level. And I hope other politicians at local level are starting to look at how they build up their support networks to make sure that nobody is sent away from an MP or an MSP or a councillor surgery not at least being able to be offered some sort of assistance in whichever way is possible locally.
Thank you very much indeed. Please will you thank our panellists for this session.